If a relationship is making you feel more alone, more confused, and less like yourself, you're not in love, you're being slowly erased. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from physical effort, but from emotional entanglement. You can feel it after a conversation that, on the surface, seemed ordinary but somehow leaves you depleted, heavy, and strangely unsettled. If this becomes a pattern, it is not something to ignore. It is something to examine very carefully. In a psychologically balanced connection, energy flows both ways. There is exchange, reciprocity, even in conflict. But here, what you may be experiencing is something different entirely. The interaction is not about mutual understanding, it is about absorption. You give attention, reassurance, patience, and yet, instead of resolution, you find yourself giving more and more, until you begin to wonder why nothing ever seems to restore itself. This is where many people make a critical mistake. They assume the exhaustion is a personal failure, that perhaps they are not communicating well enough, not loving deeply enough, not being patient enough. But the deeper issue is structural, not personal. You are trying to fill something that is not designed to be filled. From a psychological perspective, this dynamic reflects an imbalance of identity. One person seeks to stabilize themselves by drawing energy, validation, and control from the other. And the more you provide, the more the system reinforces itself. It is not a relationship that nourishes, it is one that quietly feeds on your willingness to remain. Over time, this kind of emotional drain begins to alter your internal state. You become less present, less certain, less like yourself. Not because you are weak, but because you are adapting to a pattern that demands your depletion in order to function. And that is the realization that changes everything. When connection consistently leaves you empty, it is no longer connection, it is consumption. There comes a moment in certain relationships where the conflict is no longer about what happened, but about what is real. You begin to notice a subtle shift, not in the events themselves, but in your ability to trust your own interpretation of them. You remember a conversation clearly, yet you are told it never occurred that way. You express a concern, and somehow it returns to you distorted, as though you were the one who caused it. Over time, this creates a quiet but profound instability within your own mind. At first, you try to resolve it through logic. You explain yourself more carefully. You revisit details. You attempt to clarify misunderstandings. But the more you seek clarity, the more elusive it becomes. This is because you are operating under the assumption that truth is the goal of the interaction. In a healthy dynamic, it is. In this one, it is not. What you are encountering is a form of psychological disorientation, where the narrative is constantly reshaped to maintain control. It is not always aggressive or obvious. In fact, it often appears subtle, even persuasive, but its effect is cumulative. Each small distortion, each moment of doubt, gradually weakens your internal compass. You begin to rely less on your own perception and more on the version of reality being presented to you. This is where the deeper danger lies. When a person loses trust in their own mind, they become increasingly dependent on the external voice that replaces it. Decisions become harder. Boundaries become unclear. And the sense of self, which should be stable and grounded, starts to fragment under the weight of constant contradiction. Psychologically, this is not confusion, it is conditioning. You are being trained, slowly and quietly, to question yourself so that you stop questioning what is happening to you. And once you see this clearly, one truth becomes unavoidable. If you cannot trust your own reality, you are no longer living in it, you are surviving in someone else's version of it. There is a peculiar tension that arises when effort and outcome no longer align. You give more of yourself, more time, more understanding, more restraint, and yet the result remains unchanged. In fact, it often feels as though the more you invest, the further away you move from any sense of resolution. This creates a quiet desperation, a feeling that perhaps just a little more effort, a little more patience, might finally bring things into balance. But what you are confronting here is not a failure of effort. It is a shifting standard. The expectation is never fixed, it moves, subtly and continuously, just beyond your reach. What satisfied yesterday becomes insufficient today. What was once appreciated is now expected, even dismissed. And so you find yourself in a perpetual state of striving, attempting to meet a standard that is designed to remain unmet. This dynamic is psychologically significant. It creates a loop of intermittent validation, just enough acknowledgement to keep you engaged, but never enough to provide stability. The mind, in response, becomes increasingly focused on earning approval, rather than questioning why it is so inconsistently given. You begin to measure your worth through a system that offers no consistent metric. Over time, this erodes something fundamental. You stop acting from a place of internal certainty and begin reacting to external cues. Your sense of value becomes conditional, dependent on the approval of someone who withholds it as a means of maintaining control. And the more you adapt to this, the more the dynamic reinforces itself. It is important to understand that this is not about high expectations or personal growth. Growth has direction, clarity, and mutual reinforcement. This has none of those qualities. It is a closed system, one that feeds on your continued effort without ever allowing you to arrive. And the realization, though difficult, is essential. When nothing you do is ever enough, the problem is not your inadequacy, it is the impossibility of the standard itself. There is a subtle but deeply disorienting shift that occurs when you begin to apologize, not because you have done something wrong, but because it feels necessary to preserve a fragile peace. At first, it seems like a reasonable compromise. You tell yourself it is maturity, emotional intelligence, the ability to de-escalate conflict. But over time, something begins to feel off. The apologies increase, yet the clarity does not. The tension remains, only now it is accompanied by a quiet sense of self-betrayal. What is happening here is not simply miscommunication. It is the gradual inversion of responsibility. Situations that should invite mutual reflection are instead redirected, so that the weight of resolution falls disproportionately on you. You raise a concern, and somehow you become the source of the problem. You express discomfort, and it is reframed as insensitivity or misunderstanding. And so, to restore harmony, you concede not to truth, but to pressure. Psychologically, this creates a powerful conditioning effect. Guilt becomes the mechanism through which behavior is shaped, not authentic guilt, which arises from genuine wrongdoing, but imposed guilt, subtle, persistent, and often disconnected from reality. It teaches you that maintaining the relationship requires self-blame, even when it contradicts your own perception. Over time, this distorts your moral compass. You begin to question not only what happened, but whether you are, in some fundamental way, the cause of the dysfunction. This is where the dynamic becomes particularly dangerous, because it no longer requires external force. You begin to regulate yourself, preemptively accepting fault in order to avoid conflict. And yet, a relationship that demands your guilt as its foundation cannot sustain your integrity. It asks you to trade truth for temporary calm, to silence your own awareness in exchange for momentary stability. The insight, then, is both simple and difficult to accept. When you are consistently made to feel guilty for things you did not do, the issue is not your conscience set, is the manipulation of it. There is a gradual transformation that often goes unnoticed, precisely because it does not happen all at once. You do not wake up one day and find your confidence gone. Instead, it diminishes in increments so subtle that you adapt to each loss without fully recognizing it. What was once certainty becomes hesitation. What was once clarity becomes second-guessing. And eventually, what was once a stable sense of self begins to feel uncertain, even unfamiliar. At first, you may attribute this to stress or external pressure. Life is complex, after all. But if you look closely, you will often find that this erosion corresponds directly with the relational dynamic you are in. Each dismissal of your thoughts, each contradiction of your experience, each moment where your perspective is minimized or reframed it, leaves an imprint. Not dramatic enough to confront in isolation, but cumulative in its effect. Psychologically, confidence is not simply a trait, it is a reflection of consistent internal validation. It grows when your perceptions align with reality and are acknowledged as such. But when that alignment is repeatedly disrupted, something begins to fracture. You start to distrust your instincts. You pause before speaking, calculating the potential reaction. You edit yourself, not for clarity, but for safety. This is how self-doubt takes root, not as a sudden collapse, but as a slow conditioning process. You are, in a sense, trained to abandon your own authority. And once that authority is weakened, the dynamic becomes self-sustaining. You rely more on external cues, and the very source of your uncertainty becomes the source you look to for direction. It is important to understand that this is not a natural evolution of humility or growth. True growth expands your capacity, it does, not shrink your sense of self. What you are experiencing is contraction and narrowing of your identity to fit within the constraints of someone else's control. And the realization that must follow is this: when your confidence is steadily disappearing, it is not because you are losing yourself, it is because you are being conditioned to. Perhaps the most difficult realization is not the conflict, the confusion, or even the exhaustion. It is the quiet loneliness that persists in spite of proximity. You are there, physically present, engaged in the structure of a relationship, and yet something essential is missing. There is no real sense of being seen, no genuine recognition of your inner world. Conversations may happen, time may be shared, but the connection itself feels hollow, as though it exists only on the surface. This kind of loneliness is particularly disorienting because it contradicts expectation. We assume that being with someone should alleviate isolation, not intensify it. And so, when the opposite occurs, the mind searches for explanations within itself. Perhaps you are not expressing yourself clearly enough. Perhaps you are expecting too much. But the deeper issue is not the absence of communication, it is the absence of mutual presence. In a psychologically balanced relationship, there is a meeting of two inner worlds. Each person is capable of stepping outside themselves, even briefly, to recognize the reality of the other. But in this dynamic, that movement is largely one-sided. You are aware of her emotional states, her needs, her reactions, but your own experience remains largely unacknowledged, sometimes even irrelevant. Over time, this creates a profound internal split. You continue to participate outwardly, while inwardly you begin to withdraw, not as a conscious decision, but as a form of self-preservation. The psyche, when it is not met, begins to retreat, and what remains is a sense of isolation that is deeper than physical solitude, because it exists within the very space where connection is supposed to live. This is why such loneliness feels so heavy. It is not simply the absence of others, it is the absence of being known. And without that, the relationship becomes an environment where you exist, but do not truly live. The conclusion, then, is both stark and necessary. If you feel alone in a relationship, it may not be a failure of connection, it may be evidence that true connection was never there to begin with.